What if I told you that Cosmic Skeptic admits that his very own theory of ethics doesn't actually work? What if I told you that he only pretends to have an ethical theory when in reality his entire moral philosophy is just hot air? I'm not making this up, and what you will learn by the end of this video is that by his very own admission, Alex's theory of ethics doesn't even deserve to be called that. Hi, I'm Lucas, by the way, and thanks for passing by my channel, which challenges skeptics, strengthens believers, and creates a space for awesome discussions about God. This is my second video which looks at Cosmic Skeptic's moral philosophy. Check out my first one up here, which shows you how Alex's ethical theory sanctifies rape as moral. If what I just said makes you go, huh? Then you got me exactly right, because yes, Alex's moral philosophy really is that absurd. What I'm about to show you now is that Alex's ethics is not only absurd, but that it isn't even ethics to begin with. And what's even crazier is that it's Alex himself who says this, as you will find out at the end of this video. So stick around. Let's start with a short recap of how Cosmic Skeptic builds his framework for ethics. He tells us that, first, all your actions are determined and you don't have free will. Second, all your actions are determined by your desire to maximize pleasure. This is what Alex calls the pleasure argument. Third, whether a particular action does in fact maximize pleasure can be answered objectively and scientifically. Therefore, your beliefs about what maximizes pleasure are either right or wrong. Fourth, let's say you act in ways that don't maximize your pleasure, but are subsequently shown the objective facts of what does maximize pleasure. This would result in you having to do that, given that we are determined to maximize pleasure, as the pleasure argument tells us. Fifth, ethical rightness and wrongness has therefore nothing to do with our actions in and of themselves. Instead, it can be directly established by the objective rightness and wrongness of our beliefs about pleasure. Alex tells us that you are either right or wrong as a matter of objective fact as to whether something will maximize your pleasure or not. So in case of you doing something that does not maximize pleasure, which is something that can be measured objectively, all we can say is that this indicates a belief about pleasure that you hold that is wrong. But we can't say that that thing itself is wrong. Sixth, according to Alex, this ethical framework represents a way to objectify ethics without crossing the is-ought divide, as it stays in the realm of objectivity and scientific empiricism. So that's Alex's moral philosophy in a nutshell. Watch my first video, which unpacks all of this in far more detail. And let me also say here that I'm doing my best to represent Alex's case as accurately as possible, and that I have no intention of caricaturing it. Now, let's take a closer look. As mentioned, Alex states that whenever you act in ways that do not maximize pleasure, all we can say is that this indicates a belief about pleasure that you hold that is wrong. But we can't say that that thing itself is wrong. Or in more general terms, it's not that an action you're doing is right or wrong, as objectivist moral philosophies would typically put it. Instead, it's that the action indicates a belief you hold that is right or wrong. Note the following. In this statement here, Alex is using the word wrong to mean factually wrong or incorrect. What Alex is essentially saying, and what would be the less ambiguous way of putting it, is that this indicates a belief about pleasure that you hold that is false. And that's because in philosophy, beliefs are not said to be right or wrong, but they are said to be true or false. The exact same thing applies here. Alex is essentially saying that your beliefs as to whether something will maximize pleasure are either true or false. So Alex's talk about right and wrong in these and most other cases he mentions has really nothing to do with moral rightness and moral wrongness, the two key categories we use to evaluate issues of morality. But it has everything to do with truth and falsehood, the two key categories used to evaluate beliefs. Of course, in everyday English, the words right and wrong can denote both truth and falsehood and rightness and wrongness. That's why it makes sense, colloquially speaking, to say that the belief that Earth is a cube is wrong and to say that genocide is wrong. However, the key thing to catch here is that I'm using one and the same word in two completely different ways. In the first instance, I'm making a factual judgment referring to what is or what isn't the case, whereas in the second instance, I'm making an ethical judgment about what people ought or ought not to do. This isn't to say that one can never legitimately use the terms right and wrong to mean true and false. I myself may be doing that in this very video. But it is to say that in certain contexts, using these terms interchangeably is confusing at best and misleading at worst, especially when one doesn't distinguish between the different senses of those terms. Now, I might be wrong, but it seems to me that Alex's entire case is actually built on this fatal equivocation. What he has done is essentially the following. First, he told us that pleasure can be measured objectively. He then told us that all our actions emerge from our beliefs about pleasure, as pleasure is supposedly the thing we are determined to maximize. Third, he talks about those beliefs not in the terminology of true and false, but by using the ethical terminology of right and wrong, which is a rather ambiguous way of referring to those beliefs. Based on that, Alex makes the case that what is ethically right directly corresponds to what he calls right beliefs about pleasure, and what is ethically wrong corresponds to what he calls wrong beliefs about pleasure. Thus, by virtue of using the terminology of right and wrong for both ethics and for true and false beliefs about the facts of pleasure, Alex can finally land his claim to have established an ethical framework that stays in the realm of objectivity and scientific empiricism. But the reality is that Alex hasn't offered a case for ethics at all. I mean, I'm happy to grant, for the sake of argument, that we are determined to desire pleasure, even though that's a terribly weak notion, as I show in my first video. I'm also happy to grant that pleasure can be objectively measured, though again, there are tons of problems with that, which I won't go into now. And I'm also happy to grant that our beliefs about pleasure are either true or false. But so what? What does the fact of our beliefs about pleasure being objectively true or false have to do with what is ethically right and wrong? Like nothing? Saying that the truth and falsehood of those beliefs get us to the rights and wrongs of morality is to still take the nonsensical leap from how things are to how they ought to be. And no way of phrasing the issue is going to change that. The only reason why Alex can claim to have found a way to objectify ethics without crossing the is-ought divide is because he's trading on the double meaning of the words right and wrong. It's by virtue of applying these words to both ethical judgments and the facts or beliefs about pleasure that he is able to make the double claim that he is doing ethics and that he is doing so while staying in the realm of objectivity and scientific empiricism. But in reality, none of what he says has anything to do with ethics, not even remotely. It's all just descriptive talk about true or false beliefs regarding the facts of pleasure, baptized in the language of right and wrong, which creates the impression that we are dealing with the prescriptive discipline of ethics. In other words, Alex is pulling a bait and switch. By talking about right and wrong, you think that he is presenting ethics to you, when all throughout he is simply rehashing beliefs and facts about pleasure in ethical terminology. But not a shred of what he's saying is even remotely related to ethics. Now, just to be clear, when saying bait and switch, I don't mean to suggest that Alex is being dishonest or actively trying to deceive you. I actually think that he might have confused himself by his unfortunate choice of words. Having said that, what is interesting is that in a moment of striking clarity, Alex himself recognizes that his case doesn't actually qualify as an ethical theory. Upon concluding his case, Alex tells us this: it's worth pointing out that you can talk about rightness and wrongness in terms of any action you do. What he means is the following: all our actions emerge from our desire to maximize pleasure, both actions that are conventionally considered to be morally relevant and actions that aren't. This means, obviously, that we have true or false beliefs about the facts of pleasure related to every action you can possibly perform. Now, given that truth and falsehood establish ethical rightness and wrongness, according to Alex, it actually follows that all our actions are either ethically right or wrong. Or to put it the other way around, according to Alex's ethics, there are no actions that don't have an ethical dimension to them. Alex gives the example of the way you take a sip of water, or of whether you enter your car with your left instead of your right foot first, and says that his ethics extends even to pointless issues such as these. Now, think about that. From the question of whether you stir your coffee clockwise or counterclockwise, and the question of whether you poke your nose with your left or your right hand, as well as to the question of whether you're watching this video while lying in bed or sitting on the couch. According to Alex's theory, all of these are moral issues. They are either ethically right or wrong, because you can have either true or false beliefs about what maximizes pleasure in each instance. Alex realizes that this dissolves the whole concept of ethics into pointlessness, which is why he says this.
You can say of any action that it indicates rightness or wrongness. This might seem like it's not ethical.
Yes, exactly. It certainly seems so. Alex is onto something here. But we're not done yet. Listen to what he says next.
This might seem like it's not ethical. Well, look, it's not ethics.
Did you just hear that?
Look, it's not ethics.
So, Alex's theory of ethics is, by his very own admission, not actually ethics. Having killed off his case all by himself, Alex directly turns around and tries to resurrect it by saying the following.
Look, it's not ethics. This talk is the closest we can get to ethics.
The closest we can get to ethics. Okay, I see. Now, let me tell you this. If you go hiking on a mountain without actually reaching the top of the mountain, but merely coming close to it, you cannot say that you've climbed the top of that mountain. Or if you come close to succeeding your driving test, but don't actually pass, you still won't get your driver's license. In the same way, Alex can assert as long as he wants that he may have come close to establishing objective ethics. This doesn't change the fact that he still has not established ethics, and that his ethics isn't even ethics to begin with, as he himself realizes. In other words, Alex's talk of coming close to ethics does literally nothing to rectify his theory's utter invalidity. On the contrary, it seals it once and for all. Now, here is an awfully bitter pill to swallow for Alex. He engages in moral discourse all the time, talking about animal rights, about charity, or other ethical issues. And whenever he does, he assumes, either implicitly or explicitly, the standpoint of moral objectivism. Of course, he's doing so under the impression that he has figured out a theory of objectivist ethics which he can depend on to philosophically justify his stance. And yet the truth is that he himself has pronounced his theory to be self-debunking non-ethics. In other words, Alex is telling us that he has reached the top of Mount Ethics, even though he has barely made it past base camp with his talk about the facts and our beliefs about pleasure. Thus, whenever he engages in moral discourse, he is essentially driving a philosophical vehicle he has no license for. Therefore, I suggest that Alex goes back to the drawing board to come up with an objectivist ethical framework that is actual ethics rather than non-ethics. And while he's at it, he may also want to figure out whether morality actually exists, because it's he himself who denies the existence of a moral realm, as I show in this video up here. Or if you want to find out how Alex's absurd non-ethics sanctifies rape as completely moral, check the one down here. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.